Thank you, judges. Thank you, my fellow opponent. I'm going to jump right in with the resolution. The U.S. federal government should pay African Americans reparation. I'm going to start off by defining what I mean as reparations. Reparations can come in the form of either monetary or compensatory reparations, such as land, or correcting the history books to accurately reflect African Americans' contributions. Second, I would like to define who gets the money. You have to be a direct descendant of an African American slave. We would use DNA testing along with an ancestry database. You have to be at least 50% black. I came up with the 50% rule because in an article by virginiasplace.org, they state that if you had one droplet of Negro blood, you were considered black. So I felt like 50% was more than enough of African American blood to be considered African American. Now I'm going to jump right into why the U.S. federal government should pay reparations. The first one is the U.S. government directly created laws in order to help further slavery along. And the first law that they passed was the Fugitive Slave Acts. History.com states that these laws allowed for the capture and the return of runaway slaves within the U.S. It was enacted by Congress in 1793 for local governments. Resistance to this law followed. So it led to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which added more provisions and harsher punishments for slaves and for their sympathizers. Another law that was passed by the federal government were the Jim Crow laws. My second reason why I believe that slaves, descendants of the slaves, should be paid reparations is because they had to work many hours without pay. Slaves helped bring America to what it is today, and they were not honored for that, for their hard efforts and their hard work. And their children were at a higher disadvantage than normal Caucasian Americans. So they should be paid. They should be given reparations for being at that disadvantage. Second, they were robbed of their inheritance. Slaves were not, because slaves weren't paid, they weren't allowed to the same opportunities that others were allowed. They were not allowed to go get jobs. They were not allowed to own land, so they did not have the land that many people had started off with, so they were not allotted the same opportunities that normal Americans were allowed. Second, they were robbed of their education because slaves were not allowed to get educations, and they were robbed of their constitutional rights to being allowed to have an education, so they weren't allowed to vote, and they weren't, because they didn't have an education. So their children were at a higher disadvantage than normal people. So the slaves should be given reparations for their disadvantages. So that brings me to the conclusion. Thank you everyone for listening to me speak, and I hope that you guys have a wonderful night.